Today joining us in today's conversation, who wins, who loses, how rapid cooling could narrow global inequality. We are joined by our own postdoctoral scholar Anshuman Tiwari. His research examines how environmental and climate policies affect equity and livelihoods, something which he is going to talk in detail in today's presentation. Moderating the conversation and joining us today is Professor Shrikant Gupta. So I'll invite Anshuman to please come.
We should be asking is who has contributed the most to global CO2 emissions. And I think in this regard, climate change is a stock problem. It's not a flow problem. So it doesn't matter how much, matters to some extent how much you emit this year, but what really matters is how much did your country, or if you're thinking of yourself as a person, how much did you over your lifetime emit. So what you see here is a graph you can find online anywhere, but essentially it's the developed world today, the rich countries in the world, the OECD countries, which have emitted perhaps 70-80% of overall CO2 emissions that are in the atmosphere. And so ultimately these are the guys who are mostly responsible for this problem.
Do you think that what you're doing in terms of saying early mitigation is saying that the pure rate of time preference is close to zero, and secondly the curvature of that of the function says that you cannot substitute tomorrow for today?
I think a problem here, maybe one thing I'll say technical on this, is valuing lives is difficult. So you are trading off an extra, say, life year against some consumption. Like if you're abating, that's some potential consumption you could have put into use for people who are living. And how do you do that is not so obvious. Like it's perhaps another technical wrinkle. Right? So of course there are ways to value life saved. You have the dailies and you have VSL, other ways of doing it. But I don't think necessarily Nick Stern talks about it as well. So.
I think like we are all seeing that you have this scenario, slow methane, fast methane and so on, and I think we saw that in all those scenarios actually the one that does best is fast methane. I think that's there. So what do you think is so two-part question, what do you think is really driving that result?
So methane, I guess like I alluded to it earlier, it has a higher warming potential than carbon dioxide, and it affects the global weather patterns much more rapidly as well. So the main intuition here is, if you avoid methane emissions today, what you end up getting is a very quick reduction in global temperatures straight away. These reductions are sustained. So it's not as if, we are saying you do geoengineering one time, you get all of that methane out of the atmosphere and then you pump it back in. We're saying you will have to do sustained things. So you'll have to reduce, say, emissions, again going back to the oil and gas example. Leakage has to be capped, plugged, and that has to be sustained over time.
So what's your sense of where the reductions could be, should be? I mean, I guess given your whole emphasis on equity, there's a giveaway there in terms of...
So the paper by the EDF climate scientists that we worked with, we used their scenarios for methane, and so they talk a little bit more about where those reductions might come from. You should think about, for every ton of methane I avoid from whichever source it is, what's the welfare loss? Not necessarily the income loss, the welfare loss. So if a ton of methane avoided from Indian paddy imposes a lot of, maybe in monetary terms it's not massive, but Indian farmers are poor. So even a smaller monetary loss might actually hit them much more. So that's a bigger utility loss. From the economics perspective, again, slightly larger monetary value of reducing 1 ton from an oil and gas installation in the US might not lead to that large a utility loss.
So, but anyway, I think these are very interesting. This is a very, very fascinating piece of work, a logical extension of the earlier work. And focusing on equity, I think, is absolutely something that I think is very central. Yes, you will have economic growth, which will help adaptation, but you can't grow out of this problem. economic growth doesn't take you away from this problem, and that even if you, that also the impacts are still, the impacts of delayed action are worse for the poorer parts of the world, and by corollary, bigger if you do it quickly.